Thank you for the kind introduction. And I will jump right in. I have two disclaimers to start and an apology. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. It's a real shame. I wish I could be. It sounded like a great conference, and I'm sorry that I wasn't unable to attend. But thank you for accommodating me virtually. The disclaimer, the first one is the standard one, which is that the views and opinions that I express today are not necessarily those of the U.S. Naval War College, the Department of the Navy, or the U.S. government. The second disclaimer is about my title, which has the word convoy in it. I am going to talk about convoys, but I'm doing so for illustrative purposes only. So let me be clear at the outset, I'm not arguing that convoys are a solution to today's problems. My argument concerns forgetting and remembering, not convoys. So the premise of my talk is this. 125 years ago, navies went through a period of rapid technological change. We've already heard today that we're going through a similar period of rapid change today. Then it was radios and airplanes and torpedoes and mines and more. And now it's cyber and AI and space and drones and lions and tigers and bears. Oh my. Well, 125 years ago, navies reacted to their period of rapid technological change by trying to sort through the core principles of naval warfare and ask of each principle, does this still apply in the face of changing technology? I think there are similar conversations happening today about our new technologies. Moreover, 125 years ago, navies decided that some principles of naval warfare no longer applied. Steam really was different than sail, and airplanes really did transform the character of war at sea. Sometimes navies correctly predicted how those technologies would change and how they would operate. But my talk today is an example of when they were wrong, when a core principle of naval warfare that might have looked like it no longer applied in the new technological environment was in fact still highly relevant. So therefore, my question to you today will be, are we making any similar mistakes in assuming that some core principle of naval warfare is now obsolete in the face of largely unproven technologies? I wish I knew which core principles of naval warfare we might be in danger of forgetting today. Alas, if I knew that, I'd be rich. Instead, all I have to offer you is a cautionary tale about the enduring relevance of convoys in the face of rapid technological change. So when I say convoys, uh, most of you probably think of the North Atlantic in the Second World War. And I'll get there, I promise. But the first point I want to make is that convoys have a much longer history, dating back to antiquity. In the context of this panel in Canada on the history of maritime security in North America, what matters is their history in the British Empire. What we might call the modern system of convoys dates from 1674, when the British Admiralty forbade naval captains from extorting the ships and the convoys that they escorted. Hey, I just kept you safe. How about you give me a little something extra for my trouble? In 1674, the Admiralty said, enough. We're not the mob. Okay, they didn't actually say that, but you get the point. There are actually a surprising number of examples of captains continuing to extort merchants despite the prohibition after 1674, but it's a good enough start date for our purposes today. My point is that convoys are old. Moreover, it was assumed throughout the entire age of sail that a core component of naval warfare, and therefore a core purpose of navies, was to protect trade by organizing it into convoys, as you can see happening on the screen in front of you. There were systems for organizing convoys in all the European wars of the 17th and 18th century. Depending on who was fighting whom and where, the convoys varied in coverages and routes and complexity, but they're visible in every war. I don't have time to go through all the 18th century wars. Instead, I want to focus on the convoy system in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars of 1792 to 1815. In those wars, which were larger and longer than any previous wars, the convoy system was also more rigorously organized and more essential for Britain's victory than in any previous wars. We can divide threats to British shipping into three bins. So there were French and Spanish fleets, which periodically sortied to intercept large convoys like those returning from the East and West Indies. There were privateers, which could dart out of any port in occupied Europe. And there were naval forces from smaller powers like the Barbary States, the Danish at the mouth of the Baltic, which you can see here, and from 1812, the United States. So to protect this shipping, in 1798, Parliament passed the Convoy Act, which made convoys compulsory for all shipping in the British Isles. It also imposed a tax on merchants who used convoys, which was much more civilized than being extorted. And that was highly successful. The tax brought in 1.3 million pounds in revenue in its first year to cover the cost the system. There were exemptions for coastal shipping and for the Irish ports and for some well-armed East India Company ships, but there was widespread support in government and in finance for the idea that convoys were necessary. So Lloyd's of London lobbied for this policy and supported the core principles behind it. And the result was that more British ships sailed under convoy in the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 1815 than from 1939 to 1945. Most ships in the Royal Navy in the Napoleonic Wars spent most of their time dealing with convoys. It was, as I said, fundamental to the purpose of the Royal Navy. So here are some of the major convoy routes that you can see in the North Atlantic and in European waters. You can see the North Atlantic convoy route from Canada there on the left, taking sugar, coffee, and cotton across to Europe. Or here's the home ports in Britain. The circles indicate areas where convoys gathered and were rendezvous and were organized, and then they set off going in the western approaches out of Liverpool, just like you see in the Second World War, but also all across the North Sea ports and in the Channel. Here is the importance of war materials and bullion routes crossing the North Atlantic from Canada, timber especially from Quebec, but also then gold and silver from Mexico and South America. And then you've also got the Mediterranean convoy system organized out of Malta, which was essential for British operations there. And then finally, of course, the Baltic convoy system, which was one of the most important, especially towards the end of the wars. And it worked, right? I got those images from Roger Knight's book, which you can see here on the screen, where he writes, quote, "The ultimate aim of the convoys was to maintain British political and business confidence in the strength of the economy. If convoys had failed and British trade had faltered, so would the British economy. In such circumstances, France would have won this worldwide war," end quote. So during the Napoleonic Wars, convoys were so successful that most British shipping losses came from the weather, not from enemy action. Convoys kept the British economy going, especially during the difficult last decade of the Napoleonic Wars when Napoleon's continental system closed European ports to British trade. While this effort lacked the sex appeal of the great victories like Trafalgar, it was widely understood to be the Navy's great achievement. Even the Duke of Wellington said so. And so for 99 years after 1815, the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars were known in Britain as the Great Wars. They were the reference points for everyone thinking about what the next war might look like, just as we today still tend to fall back on studying the Second World War for our historical cases. So the wars of 1792 to 1815 were what Europeans thought about when they thought about war. And you have to look no farther, of course, than Clausewitz. Or more specifically for my purposes today, Sir Julian Corbett, the great naval theorist of Edwardian Britain. Corbett's Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, published in 1911, remains a standard textbook for thinking about how naval operations fit into grand strategy. We still read it today at the Naval War College, of course. Most of Corbett's principles are drawn from his close study of the Age of Sail. He was a pioneering historian, and his books on the Trafalgar Campaign and on the Seven Years' War are both still standard references for historians today. So you might think that Corbett would have understood the importance of convoys to maritime strategy. But in fact, convoys were one of the few areas where Corbett concluded that new technologies, and especially the transition from sail to steam, made convoys obsolete. So here's what he said. Again, this was in 1911. He said, attacking ships in 1911 are faster relative to the speed of convoys than they were in the Age of Sail. Attacking ships are also more likely to be more powerful relative to the convoys than they were in the Age of Sail. So what one cruiser could do in 1911 versus what a ship of the line could do in 1811 are vastly different things. He also pointed out that geography in a war with Germany was likely to help constrain the ability of the Germans to get out into the North Atlantic shipping routes because the British could, mine home waters and keep the Germans in the North Sea. And then he also pointed out that privateers had been outlawed in the 1856 Paris Declaration respecting maritime law. Privateers have been a major threat to British shipping in the Napoleonic Wars, and now they were no longer allowed. Attacking ships were also supposed to let people off before they sank the ships in 1911 based on that same declaration. He also pointed out that coal-burning warship ranges were very short in 1911 compared to the Age of Sail, so raiders couldn't sit on convoy routes, right? In the Age of Sail, all you needed was enough food and water, and you could sit on a headland where you knew that shipping was going to be coming around and intercept trade in that way. But coal-burning warships couldn't do the same thing because their ranges were so much shorter. Finally, he pointed out that radios were going to be essential for routing convoys around, or routing shipping around potential surface raiders. And if there was an attack on shipping, the radio could be used to call reinforcements to the site of the attack. And in any case, you need hundreds of cruisers to attack British shipping, he said, and there was no way that any power could build hundreds of cruisers. So Corbett concluded, quote, modern developments and changes in shipping and naval material have indeed so profoundly modified the conditions of commerce protection that there is no part of strategy where historical deduction is more difficult or more liable to error, end quote. And Corbett's thoughts on trade protection were perfectly in line with contemporary naval thinking. We have probably seen the last of the convoy system, end quote, said one reviewer of some principles when it appeared. And in any case, Corbett's analysis, comprehensive analysis, was actually spot on when it came to German surface raiders. The British did, in fact, deal with them quickly and effectively in the first years of the First World War. But of course, while I went through Corbett's argument, you weren't thinking about surface raiders, you were thinking about U-boats. Corbett and the Royal Navy failed to anticipate that submarines would become the dominant form of commerce raider. They could carry enough torpedoes to do serious damage to a convoy. They could transit through British home defenses undetected. They could sink ships without warning, stay at sea for long enough to sit on convoy routes, and evade detection by submerging. Moreover, they were cheap to build, so the Germans really could build hundreds. Here's a chart of all the ships that the Germans sunk in the First World War. I don't know if you can see it, but the little red dots on the map are sunk British ships. That's a lot of little red dots. That's a lot of dead sailors, and that's a large percentage of the British economy on the bottom of the sea. So Corbett has one very good excuse for his poor analysis of the threat to British trade. In 1911, when he wrote some principles, submarines weren't capable of doing what you see there on the slide. I don't want to bury Corbett just because he didn't predict rapid advances in submarine technology, though. Instead, I want to focus on the core principles of trade protection that he described, because it turns out that while he correctly identified some of the challenges that commerce raiding would face, he misunderstood the fundamental reasons why convoys were necessary. In other words, it's not just that he failed to foresee submarine technology development. It's a rare example of Corbett's head getting turned by emerging technologies, causing him to fail to understand the central ideas at work. I hope this discussion will encourage us to proceed with caution as we conduct our own analysis of today's security environment. Let's not throw out older principles derived from bitterly gained experience and careful historical analysis just because of the theoretical promise of a new technology. So briefly, why did convoys work? It's actually not all that intuitive, and it wasn't just Corbett who failed to understand the mechanism. So Bernard Brodie, who went on to become a great nuclear theorist, made some of the same mistakes in his 1944 book on naval strategy. Convoys relied on one core component of the maritime domain. The ocean is really big. Convoys concentrated ships into one small area that made them hard to find. If you have 50 ships sailing independently, you have 50 different points to attack and 50 different points to defend. Moreover, each ship is visible from a certain distance. Putting them all together doesn't increase the distance based relative to one ship by much, and it removes all the detection areas from elsewhere in the ocean. Navies even discovered that unescorted convoys were just about as effective as escorted convoys at protecting trade simply because of the detection benefits. That's not to say that navies or merchant ships preferred unescorted convoys, of course. Combat was part of convoy operations, but it was a secondary factor in their effectiveness. Through 1945, convoys also relied on the fact that even when concentrated, it was not usually possible for attackers to sink or capture all the ships in a convoy. There were usually more targets than torpedoes, usually. Convoys also served as bait, luring attackers into a position in which escorts could engage them. So if you put a convoy in the western approaches, you didn't need to go looking in a big ocean for tiny U-boats. They would come to you. That was what Alfred Thayer Mahan argued in his discussion of convoys. He said, quote, the convoy system, when properly systematized and applied, will have more success as a defensive measure than hunting for individual marauders, a process which, even when most thoroughly planned, still resembles looking for a needle in a haystack. And that's how convoys worked. They made detection more difficult. They relied on the difficulty that attacking forces had in carrying enough weapons to sink all the ships, and they brought attackers into a position where escorts could engage them. So not only, therefore, did the British institute a convoy system belatedly in the First World War, but more famously, they instituted naval control of shipping on the first day of the Second World War. This time, they didn't get their heads turned by new technologies in the interwar period. And I think it's important to note that there were several technologies that might have caused them to wonder if convoys would still be relevant. Airplane ranges had improved dramatically, suggesting that the Germans might be able to coordinate between air and sea to locate convoys, and the British had developed ASDIC, or sonar, which promised to allow them to detect submerged U-boats. British developments in high-frequency detection finding and radar also suggested a new world of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance might be on the horizon. Nevertheless, to their immense credit, the British and especially the Canadians realized that convoys were still relevant. They learned their lesson from the First World War. As the admiral and theorist Herbert Richmond put it in 1930, instruments alter, principles remain. A fact which those who so loosely talk of the new weapons, the submarine, the aircraft, and the mine, having revolutionized warfare, would be wise to bear in mind. Concentrating ships into small areas made them easier to protect and more difficult to detect, even if there were advances in detection and firepower that suggested they also made them vulnerable. It was on the back of the transatlantic convoy system, organized among the Canadians, the British, and eventually the Americans, that the war in Europe was fought and won. Convoys were the essential precondition for victory, still relevant in 1945, despite all the changes in technology around them. Now, to reiterate, I'm not suggesting that the answer to the next great power war is convoys. I'm not qualified to muse on how ISR works today and what the implications of that are for the safety of shipping in the open ocean. Presumably, the detection benefits that I enumerated no longer apply, but that's just a guess on my part. I've read enough to know that direct defense of trade via convoys seems less likely now than it did in 1939 or even in the 1980s, but one way or another, there will need to be some mechanism to protect trade in the next war. That is, after all, one of the fundamental reasons to deploy force at sea. What I'm trying to convey is that in the First World War, the British thought that emerging technologies had made convoying obsolete. It did not help that the technological changes seemed to play into their cultural prejudices about why they had a great navy. Trade protection is dull, frustrating work. Nobody became a hero in the Napoleonic Wars because they escorted a convoy. Wouldn't it be easier if the ships could just get from A to B without bothering the Navy about it? They were wrong. Why they were wrong, I think, is relevant to today's problems. They were wrong partly because they didn't want to face the fact that the Navy's greatest contribution to the last war had been not winning fleet battles, but protecting trade. I encourage navies today to ask themselves whether they have similar preconceived notions about what navies do and whether they're being honest with themselves about what really matters at sea. But the main point I tried to make today is that Corbett and the British in 1911 were wrong mostly because they assumed that technological changes had made older forms of naval warfare obsolete. Those technologies were changing so quickly, though, that they didn't have time to adjust their thinking before the onset of hostilities. It would have been safer if they had placed less trust in the transformative or revolutionary nature of new technologies and more trust in the enduring principles that characterize war at sea. Are there older concepts that practitioners today need to reassess along the same lines? And are we sure the older concept is obsolete? Thanks for your time.